All right, Trials Progression friends, I am joined today by Stu Preston of Jack Cycles, and I'm really excited to be talking about suspension. Before we get rolling, Stu, do you mind sharing with us your trials experience as well as your experience with suspension?
I'd be happy to give a quick rundown. Been riding trials competitively since 1974, so I'm starting my second 50 years of trials fun. Been around all the bikes for all these years. Enjoyed the change in technology, techniques. It's been a fantastic journey. I look forward to more. As far as suspension, awesome. I feel very, very lucky to have had direct contact with World Championship riders. Specifically, Adam Raga has visited my shop in the past and done a wonderful job of communicating with us in understandable ways that seem to be tough to find in this sport. So yes. There's many different opinions. Suspension is always going to be a subjective topic. I don't think there's any absolute black, white, right or wrong. But there are some good information data that we can work with to help guide riders to their optimal setup. A lot of fun over the years and some good achievements as a support class rider. Won an FIM title back in 2003 as a vet rider for North American champion. So I'd like to think I have a fair amount of experience in the zones as well as in the shop.
Perfect. And now your shop is unique because you guys actually rebuild Reiger shocks here in the States, correct?
That's true, Tom. We're fortunate to be the only factory authorized Reiger service in the United States. I've been in communication and working with them since 2013. We've met in person in Europe. We communicate often here. Worked with their riders, with their technicians, and very happy to have their knowledge and database available here for the USA.
Awesome. So I will include links below as it relates to getting a hold of Stu, and if you need your shock freshened up or different size springs, we will include all that, especially towards the end as well as in the description. But Stu, let's start out with just a simple question. Bikes are set up from the factory for a specific rider weight. They're not necessarily a one-size-fits-all, and in my experience, a lot of trials riders are bigger guys. They're more than the typical weight. So do you mind sharing with us what the typical weight is, and then how that becomes important as it relates to suspension?
Having visited trials events in Europe and in America, I would say the average weight difference between the average European and the average American trials rider is probably about 30 pounds. The bikes are set up from the factory to run about 160 to 180 pound weight. Both Tony Bow and Adam Raga were right around 170 pounds, and that seems to be the target weight for the production motorcycles. So, you know, if you're above or below that weight, the bike's not going to work at its optimal capacity, and the opportunity to get these set up properly can make significant differences.
Now, when it comes to used bikes, I imagine a lot of people aren't getting a bike that's factory, set up as it relates to the suspension, but they're getting used bikes, and someone may have wrenched and changed suspension and things like that. I guess, what's your advice for someone who's buying a bike and they're not sure what the normal settings are as it relates to suspension?
As with most mechanical situations in tuning, you want to make sure that your components are in good shape, that the linkage bearings are good, that they're greased, that there's no excess drag in the linkage or somewhere present in the suspension system. Another example is the swing arm pivot. We want to make sure that all these components are up to snuff because they can affect the action of the suspension quite obviously. So before we start dialing the shock, we want to make sure that the suspension components of the bike are in good shape. At that point, we can start to evaluate what changes might be able to move you forward from there. After that, of course, with a used bike, there's no way to know for sure what might have been changed or what might not. The shocks do wear out over time. We find that usually around 60 to 80 hours is a good service interval for these shocks if you're looking for optimal performance. A casual sportsman rider can probably go a season or two, but at that point, the shock degrades a percentage at a time, and over a long period of time, you make the change to rebuild it, and suddenly the significant difference is quite noticeable. So they wear out slowly, very slowly.
And I imagine a lot of people want to know what knobs to twist to make themselves optimal, but can we take a moment before we get into the specifics of how we would set up a suspension to talk about why it's so important? I know when I first started riding, I was watching guys like Tony Bow and Adam Raga, and they're hopping all around, and I thought, oh, they must have some special springs or something, that's what makes them hop, not realizing that it's probably the turning, which is the most important aspect of getting the suspension out. So do you mind sharing a little little bit about why suspension setup. What happens when it's optimized and what happens when it's not optimized?
Well, I think instinctively people think of suspension performance in regards to bump reaction, hitting the obstacles. How does the bike behave? But almost above and beyond that is the effect on geometry of the motorcycle chassis. So the height that the bike rides at is definitely affected by spring rates. And that height has to be optimized if you expect the chassis to perform as the bike was designed. So, the classic example is a heavy guy. The bike is squatting in the back. The front wheel's pushing in the turns, and they don't understand why. If you put a stiffer spring and get that bike dialed in for the right ride height, suddenly the bike carves like a scalpel, and people are amazed at the difference in handling. So there's two aspects of suspension to think about: the geometry of the bike and then the bump and rebound reaction of the suspension itself. Both are very important.
So Stu, I totally agree with you as it relates to getting it dialed in. I know for myself, I had a bike with a softer spring. When I got it, I think it was actually less. It was like a 70 or a 65. It was less than what I needed, and I'm about 200 pounds now. And so it was just sitting low in the back, and the front end was washing out a decent bit. And I thought, man, I'm just not very good at making these turns because I kept washing out the front tire. And eventually, through conversations with other people and you as well, I wound up going to a stiffer rear spring, and what a difference it made. I also cranked up the preload a little bit more, so now I was riding kind of like a horse that's ready to spring instead of some lame old raggedy type of bike, and it just made a big difference in my ability to turn, carve things out, as well as any unload moves like zaps, splatters, hopping, stuff like that. So I appreciate your help as it related to getting mine dialed in, and I think I've actually probably bought at least 3 springs, 2 or 3 springs off of you so far, so it does make a difference. Let's talk for a moment about some common myths as it relates to trials, because this is something that I feel like sometimes circulates. When it comes to a motocross bike and they're taking these huge jumps and they're talking, you got to get your suspension dialed. That's one side. And then on the other side, you have people say it's a trials bike. It doesn't matter, or it's not important, or just ride it. Can you tell me why that concept of it's a trials bike, it doesn't matter, just ride it, maybe why you think it perpetuates and how maybe that might not be accurate?
Well, of course, these are all personal opinions, but my take on that is that, the trials bikes are very capable, and there is so much for a new rider to learn. I mean, there is a lot involved in this sport. So, yes, you can progress on a stock motorcycle with less than optimal setup. Yes, you can improve. Will you get as good as you could? No. Can you get better? Yes. Is there an opportunity to learn on the bike even though it's not set up? Yes, there is. But you will do better ultimately with a bike that's set up properly. So I think in trials, this is, we hear this more often because the bikes aren't stressed as much in most of the classes. Till you get to an expert or pro level, the bikes aren't being pushed very hard compared to what they're designed to take. So for trials, it's more casual. Let's use that word as far as the suspension for most sportsman riders. However, even a casual motocross rider of over 200 pounds needs to make sure they are protected when they land on a big impact. We don't see that as much in trials. So I think for that reason, people stay away from the optimal setup, not as anxious to approach it. I think that's basically where it comes from. As far as suspension setup for different caliber riders, we find in racing, off-road sports, enduro, hare scrambles, specifically motocross, the faster the rider, the stiffer the setup. If you're a pro racer, your bike is going to seem stiff to a novice. If you're a novice rider, his bike's going to be soft for the pro. In trials, it's the opposite. The novice rider needs protection because his technique is not as good as the pro rider in trials. The pro trials rider can run a softer setup because his body mechanics are so good, or I should say he or she. Their body mechanics are so good on the bike that they can absorb the impact. They don't need to work a shock to protect them as much as a novice. So in motocross, you have soft for novice, stiff for expert. In trials, it's almost the other way around. You have stiffer for novice to protect them and softer for the pro because he can get better traction with that softer setup, and he will prioritize that.
All right, so Stu, when it comes to setting up suspension, which is I think what a lot of people probably came to this video wanting to know, can you give us an overview, a brief kind of highlight on how someone should set up their suspension for a trials bike?
Absolutely. We would start with the preload, or the ride height of the back of the bike is the most critical factor. We're talking about Reiger shocks specifically today. A Reiger shock spring has 140 millimeter free length. When we put it on the shock, we add 10 millimeters of preload for a starting point. We can increase that preload 3 more millimeters till we have 13 millimeters of preload. If it's still not stiff enough at that point for the rider, we go to a stiffer spring. The window for preload on the Reiger is 7 to 13 millimeters. You set it at 10. Oh gosh, it feels a little stiff. Okay, let's back it down. You can back it down to 7 millimeters, and at that point it will be softer. If you feel like you need to go further, at that point you change the spring. So this is how we determine how to get the bike set up for the rider. We look at their weight. We can estimate the spring they need. We can set their preload at 10 millimeters. They can go up and down 3 millimeters to adjust, test the feel. If they want to go in a different direction, we can change the spring again. Very often, I will sell someone a spring as a starting point. If they want to try it for a couple weeks, they feel they want to exchange it for a different one, I do that for them. It's different for everybody. I can't say that I know what you need. I have to hear from you what you feel. And so I try to work with the riders and give them an opportunity to experiment. You buy one spring, send it back in good shape. I'll exchange it for you to try a stiffer or a softer one. How many times have we had to do that? I would say out of hundreds of shocks, maybe twice. So we can usually get pretty close with it on the first try.
Awesome. So stiffer or less stiff spring, adjusting the preload in the rear, and then where do you go from there as it relates to trying to get the geometry set up accurately?
I should mention that the preload setting for the bike varies by brand. All right. So in the example of a gas, a TRS, we set that shock so that the bike sits at its full ride height. So this is called a free sag measurement as opposed to a rider sag measurement. In most off-road sports, they use a rider sag. They measure the bike at its full height with no rider aboard, off the ground. They put the rider on it. They settle it in. How far is the bike squished down? It's really hard to do it that way with a trials bike. It's almost impossible. Now, maybe some people would argue or contest that preload can be done accurately, but it's hard to do it repeatably in my experience. Working with the top world round riders, they work with the free sag of the motorcycle with no rider aboard. Now, as I mentioned, TRS and gas, we set at the top of the travel. When you push down on the back of the bike and release it, you want it to come to its full ride height. If you're working with a Sherco, a Scorpa, a Beta, those bikes want 5 to 15 millimeters of free sag in their suspension with no rider aboard. So brand to brand, the setup varies a little bit. These are considerations made by the factory, by their engineers, and they determine how they want to build their bike. Some of the brands want to build it with some sag involved. Other brands say, no, we don't. So there's no real right or wrong, just different approaches. But we need to know these numbers from brand to brand so we can get the optimal starting point.
And I feel like sometimes it's hard to find out how much free sag or rider sag a bike should have based on brands. Are these numbers anywhere that people can find them?
There was a nice video done by Ryan Young a few years ago where he expounded on the setup for Pat Smadge's Shercos. And he discussed the preload number for Sherco as 5 to 15 millimeters. That's an example out to the public where that number has been mentioned. Once again, I work with the factories and with their riders. It's a philosophy in how they design the bike, whether they want sag in it or not. I'm sure there's some debatable theories on that, but I mean, all the bikes seem to have their own strengths and weaknesses. They all work in similar ways. I think it's different ways to achieve the same thing. So it's important if you set up a TRS or a gas with sag, free sag, it's not going to steer well. It's not going to rebound as it should. You set that bike at zero sag, it's another motorcycle. Conversely, you take a bike like a Sherco or a Vertigo, it's set up to run some sag. You set that up too tight, it's not going to do as well. It's going to lose traction. It's going to knife the front end. So the sag settings have a huge influence on the geometry of the motorcycle. And as we mentioned before, spring rate is the other factor. So we have to juggle spring rate and preload numbers to arrive at the geometries we're looking for.
So after getting the rear preload scored away, do you then move on to the front preload?
Yes, yes. And we find that numbers from 25 to 35 millimeters of free sag in the forks are excellent numbers to work with. You can go up or down a little bit, either way in that range. Experiment in different sections. I always make sure if I'm asking somebody, we're working, trying to set up suspension, that we involve some uphills, some downhills, and perhaps off-camber turns might be some of the best indicators of how your bike really feels in the turns. So flat ground is one issue. You get into cambers and angles, that's when you really start to feel these subtle differences.
Stu, as it relates to the front preload and the front shocks, is it common for people to have to change out the front spring, or is that not as needed? Can you tell me kind of what's the threshold, or when would someone need to replace the front shocks?
That's an excellent question, Tom. We find that we can raise the rear spring rate by 2 increments on most of these bikes and still utilize the stock fork spring. So for example, we have, let's pick a TRS. It comes with a 7.0 Newton meter spring. The next step up is 7.2.5. The second step is 7.5. The third step is 8.0. Each one gets progressively stiffer. We can go up to the 7.5, 2 increments, add preload to the stock fork spring, and get excellent performance. We find that when we move to the third increment and go to the 8.0 or the 8.5, at that point you need to go to a stiffer fork spring to complement that increased rate in the rear and keep the geometry of the motorcycle balanced. So in most cases, you don't need a fork spring. In extreme cases, you do.
And then what about damping? Because we've got rear shocks, got multiple things of damping: rebound damping, compression damping, depending upon what spring you've got or what shock setup you got, and then you got front, damping on the forks. Where do you go as it relates to damping? How do you determine that?
A basic rule of thumb would be to start with the stock setting, and if you were to add a stiffer shock, or a stiffer shock spring, if you're going to add a stiffer spring rate to the shock, then the rebound will have to work a little harder to control that energy. So generally, if we're putting on a stiffer spring, we will slow the rebound a little bit to control that extra spring. If we're going to do a softer spring, we'll go a little bit lighter on the rebound for the same reason. I always recommend starting with the stock clicker setting on any of these spring rates just to evaluate it. And then with a Reiger, we like to move 2 or 3 clicks at a time at first to feel the difference significantly, and then maybe you hone in down to a single click at the end.
And now, Stu, I really appreciate the insight that you have on setting up a bike, and I do want to get a little more specific with it, but I know sometimes it's challenging on YouTube to follow along. And so for those of you that don't know, I've got a trials curriculum that's got tons and tons of content, and Stu and I are actually going to continue this conversation in that screen. So if you guys go to my website, trialsprogression.com, you guys can see more content from Stu as we actually dive into some more detail as relates to the step-by-step ways to set up the suspension. Stu, before we kick this off, is there anything else that you want to add that would be helpful for the average rider? And also, where can people find information as it relates to your shop and the services you provide?
Well, I would hope Jack Cycles would be easy to find on a search. I'm a little bit of an old-fashioned guy. I'm not as much of an online guy as maybe some of the other shops, but I've been around trials a long time. I'm very hands-on. Easy to reach. If somebody reaches out, I'll always get back. I do get a high call volume, so sometimes it's a few minutes, sometimes it's an hour or two. But very passionate about this sport and serving the people of the sport, and we care over here. So I think that's why we are the Reiger Service Center. I think that's why we have the input from world champions that have visited here, is that they know we're here for the right reasons, and we want to help this. We want to help the sport. We want to help people enjoy this great sport of trials. And if you get your bike working better, you're going to enjoy it more. So we all enjoy the challenge. We have to learn to embrace the failure in this sport and celebrate the successes. So I'm easy to find. Look for me at jackcycles.com. Happy to talk to anybody at length to try to get you set up. We don't go away after the sale. I'll work with you for as long as you want to get your bike improving as you improve. And you might find that 2 years later, you need a different setup than you did 2 years ago because your skills are better. So, it's a moving target. We're here to help.
Awesome, awesome. And now, Stu, do you just service Reiger, or do you also sell other springs or help for? I know some people have EMs and they've got what is it, Showa springs.
Oh yes, I mean,
some
I
people
have
have
access
vintage
to
stuff.
springs.
So talk to me. What else do you service?
We can do service on most shocks. Some are rebuildable, some are not. RS16V is a shock that we usually don't rebuild from Olay, but we do have spring rates available. So Showa shocks from Montesa, we do service those on a regular basis. The Showa is very serviceable. We have access to parts for those. TRP is another good shock that we can get parts for. So we're happy to try to fix whatever you have. If you give us a call in your specific situation, we'll see what we can work out, and we can service most of the shocks in the trials industry.